listening to the Adventure Party for the 3rd week of October 2023. This week, the party decided to ask the big question: what if? The Adventure Party, discussing tabletop related gaming the Irish way.
Welcome to the party. I'm Owen.
I'm Warlord Scar.
I am Dave.
And today, it's a prism of endless possibility, where a single choice can branch out into infinite realities, creating alternate worlds to the one you know. I am the Watcher. I am your guide through these vast new realities. Follow me and ponder the question: what if? Today in the Adventuring Party, we have a new theme that we're going to explore. A series of what if questions. What if certain things happened a different way in gaming? And we're going to postulate what might have spun out as a result and the origins of these questions. Our Discord has coughed forth a veritable plethora of different questions about theories and might have beens and what wases to talk about, and we're going to run through a couple of them here today.
Definitely food for thought.
I'm going to start out with one that kind of occurred to me. And back in the early days of D&D, Dave Arneson had a campaign as part of the original kind of playtest. And one of his players was playing a class called Vampire, where he was a vampire. And this is interesting because the vampire didn't make it through the playtest. But the class that was created in reaction to the vampire hunter did. Well, the vampire already seemed a bit limited. So the vampire hunter became the cleric or priest, which did hang around and has tremendous longevity. So what does D&D look like if there was a vampire class in it?
Yes, for those who are looking up their history, I believe the character in question was originally called Baron Fang of Castle Blackmore, and he very quickly became Baron Fang for, obvious reasons.
So what would a vampire class look like?
That's actually the question that's been bothering me the most about this, because early D&D are like pre the original 3 brown books. D&D was a volatile place, but I don't know if it was mechanically dense enough to really bring across the vampires we would know today. Because, like, in a modern game, you'd assume something like Savage Species did for Third Ed, where you'd split the vampires' powers up into little chunks and give out a bit of power every level. So, like, level 1, you get very weak bite attack, but heals your hit points, and then level 3, you get climb, but it's at half speed, or level 5, you get hypnotism, or, you'd split it up. But I'm not sure that was quite the way things really worked in early games. I get the more impression that they'd feel like, until the Paladin came along, no other class really had that to the same degree. Like, arguably the Thief, but again, the Thief didn't arrive until like a year after the original game was done. So it would have been interesting to see them basically be forced to either create this unbalanced class and just say, yeah, you get all your vampire powers level 1, but like maybe they're level dependent in some way, like maybe you only bite for 1 hit point, and then
No, Shane. Let's think about this the way they would have thought about it back then. They would have thought the vampire has to be stronger than the fighter, number 1, because it's a vampire. Now, whether they decided to make that a stat requirement that you needed to roll an 18 to basically play a vampire, which they might said you can only run a vampire if you roll 18 strength.
Entirely possible.
Yeah, absolutely, right? They could be like, yeah, you're only allowed to roll a vampire if you roll 18 strength. And then you probably would have a vampire strength table that was different to the percentile strength table. That you're basically like, you can only roll a vampire if you roll 18 strength. And now you get to go onto the vampire strength progression table. And they might have decided, yeah, you're just super strong. They might go, oh, no. You've got to drink blood to increase your strength. And that became the whole mechanic of the vampire, was you basically supped on blood. And they probably had a ridiculous table of more powerful bloods to drink based on the animal you were fighting that you would increase your strength by. Like, isn't that the kind of thing they do?
Yeah, that sounds like it. like if you said that's how they did it in some alternate reality, I wouldn't be shocked.
Yeah, no, I think that's quite possible. And then you started to wonder, well, would people start demanding alternate progression paths? Because, like, you're not drinking XP out of people, you're drinking strength points. So that means that other classes, maybe they should have an ability to gain their powers over time. Because then you have, it's entirely possible they would just leave the other classes as is, because that'd be the way it happens sometimes.
I think they might do something funky like not have it level. That it's just all based on its strength goes up based on how much blood you drank, and that affects your attack bonuses, and your hit points are based on what blood you drank, and that's based on when you hit that you start to lose blood, so you start to lose some of your power. I think it could be really wacky, and that's probably why they did. That might be one of the reasons they ditched it. I think it would start out as just a super strong fighter, and then it became okay. Let's do something wacky and full of tables with this, and piercing weapons doing more damage because they cause more blood loss and stuff. You can see all
Yeah.
this happening, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it all seems very plausible. Now, we go into the really hypothetical, really out there predictions and wonder what happens if they actually, saw sense and realized, we should probably balance this. And if it survives the playtest in a form that is largely compatible with other classes, then you're just getting in a situation where you're really leaning into one of early D&D's foibles, and that's the races class system.
Yeah.
Oh yes.
So this is a thing that happened not in original D&D, but in basic D&D. So like 3 years after the original D&D came out, they created the new simpler version, and they decided that whatever, I forget the guy's name, he was a doctor and really liked D&D, and they just sort of it's one of those situations where like he basically walked into the TSR office to ask them if they wanted to have a hand, and like 2 weeks later he was writing an entire new edition of the game because that's how they rolled back in the early days. But he decided that the interplay between elf mages and dwarf fighters and all this was too much, too fiddly, maybe just like too abusable. And for the purposes of getting basic players going, it was better to roll everything into just classes. So all elves were fighter mages, all dwarves were just slightly tougher fighters. They had different XP totals to show their racial abilities, and that was good enough in the eyes of again, I've Holmes. Yeah, Dr. Holmes. No, this would have been Holmes basic.
So actually, apparently, one of the things they used to do was the whole point of the lower XP caps on the races was you'd play an elf for a bit, and then you go back to playing your other character, or go back to playing another. The cap was I play an elf for a bit, and then I'm done. I wonder would they have had a vampire have quite a low level cap, and you play it for a bit, and then you stop being a vampire. But your whole thing on the vampire is it's based on how tough the guys you're fighting are. That's where you get so the vampire would become this weird hyper ambitious class in play. So you get a bunch of stories about it, and then the vampire said we had to fight him because he wanted his blood. And there will be tons of kind of weird maladaptive play out of that. And in much the way everyone's got bad paladin stories, I think everyone would have terrible vampire stories. Where they were talking about that time the vampire ruined D&D. And now I want you to think that if it was a base class, how does that ripple through and start affecting the other big settings and campaigns of D&D?
I definitely think that just having this kind of potentially antagonistic class in your game puts way more emphasis on the sort of war game style faction play, where you have there would be far more emphasis on having lawful aligned parties and chaotic aligned parties, to use the parlance of the day. It would have been very much more like there wouldn't be parties so much as there would be teams.
Yeah.
And you would essentially be making, oh, this is it. This party is going to be chaotic. So yeah, we can have one vampire anymore, and they'll start eating each other or something.
Yeah. And when you look at it, when you look back, I mean, it was clearly enough on their minds that they created a whole class to counter it.
I mean, that's a big deal.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you had like, okay, they created the priest or cleric comes out of this as originally the vampire hunter. So clearly they felt there needed to be counterplay for this one. So they probably had a bunch of exotic communities and strange powers. But if we take a look at how does Ravenloft look different if there's a vampire class?
Oh, they see Strahd not as necessarily the big bad, but as the big opposition. As in, oh, I want his job.
I want Strahd's blood. And there would probably be a whole plot line of those who drink Strahd's blood become Strahd and become trapped in the same fate as Strahd. Like that would be the whole thing, wouldn't it? You'd be looking like, yeah, that's what's going to happen.
Ravenloft was very much about hubris.
Yeah, absolutely. Now take one of the Dragonlance cast and recast them as a vampire.
I mean, Raceland is the obvious choice there. He's the kind of guy you say he'd try vampire for a little while, see how it goes, and then
I actually think the person who'd be a vampire out of that bunch, there was two people, right? But the first one would be Stern Brightblade. And you'd recast the Knights of Salmania as vampires who are honorable vampires who hold to this code. Because one of the things about there was always a little bit of tweaking of stuff in Dragonlance. Things are a little bit different. Oh, gold's worthless. Steel's what you need. This is a weird thing. So all these honorable vampires that hang around and take the blood tithe from their people and protect them otherwise. Like that would be the whole thing. If I could fight a dragon and drink its blood, I'll be strong enough to slay dragons.
I mean, that'd be pretty handy.
It'd be a real different spin on what the knights are not as strong as they once were because the dragons were gone because they didn't have those things to drink. Like, would that look different? Would it be way cooler? I was like, the Knights of Salmania, they're weaker because they didn't have the dragons to fight, but then the dragons return. If they can drink their blood, they'll be strong enough to fight them. And the Dragon Lance, the giant stake thing. We're getting stuff going here. Eh? But brother, you got a stew going.
Yeah. Dark Sun would have extra instead of defilers. I think you'd have some kind of psychic vampires, probably.
Probably, I would say a very different take. There's a lot of sun in Dark Sun. I'd say the vampire having explicit weaknesses would be and weird workarounds would probably be quite common at that stage.
A lot of underground movement, as in literally underground.
Yeah, it could be weird termite vampires. You could be they're all three green and in Dark Sun. Something weird. They come out at night mostly. They mostly come out at night.
Part of it makes me think of it as like any endless demands of people for variety, and the endless, like, what happens when you get to like the first couple of supplements and people are demanding, oh yeah, we've had vampires, but what do we do next? Are we going to have Death Knights next, or are we going to have playable demons next? Or we're going to try to do some kind of weird beholder thing, or like, what are we going to do next? Like, can't just stop at vampires. It's 1978. Vampires are old hat at this point.
I think there will be people who say we stop at vampires. The vampires are established adventurers. Everything else is ridiculous. You can't have a ghost. But I think ghosts would be a thing. I think zombies would be one. I think skeletons. I think the classic guys and some form of Frankenstein's monster will work in there. And maybe werewolves. I don't know, but I'd say they'd be very different things. And what does White Wolf do when it comes along in 10 years later?
Well, darker and edgier. Like that's what they will do. Like,
would White Wolf be instead doing? Will do witches and wizards in the modern day, not vampires. They don't start with vampires because vampires are a D&D monster or a D&D hero.
Yeah, we're not about D&D. That's too mainstream. We were about the real, original storytelling.
Yeah, we're here to tell stories, not slurp on blood and get more powerful. That's crazy talk. And now you were saying as well, you were looking about the Dragons at Dawn, which was kind of based on Dariv Arneson's original one. There's no vampire class in that, though, I believe.
So something I spotted in an old review in a issue of Fight On magazine about the OSR, and there was no vampire class in it, but there was some interesting bits and pieces. It does sound like quite a bit changed between when Arneson was running D&D and when even the original D&D as we know it emerged out of TSR. Stuff about how hit points are dealt with. Like, you can cast a lot of spells, but there's penalties for each one, and the component cost sounded ruinous, to put a word on it.
That's the thing. Keep you adventuring. Got to get your components for your spells. Because that's one of the things. There was drivers in old D&D where they tried to make, like, that was gold pieces. You wanted gold to pay for training, level up. That's why it was XP. And it was trying to drive players into the dungeon. And I think they do the same with the vampire. All right, guys, any thoughts before we move on to your scintillating questions, your strange hypotheticals?
I think we've drained this husk dry.
Gotcha.
I do want to make one point. So, just talk about all the different classes of monsters and beasties. Definitely by third edition, you could just create them with game rules, because third edition D&D had so many splash books. You could make pretty much whatever character you want. A psychic, intelligent ape, no problem. Undead characters, no problem. But they weren't the default. They weren't in the core book. And I don't just. It's just that these things appeared, but by the time they appeared in official books, it still wasn't in the core book. It still wasn't it still wasn't the standard. Anyway, I think it's time to move on to another question.
All right.
I can go next because I got one that really weirded me out when I saw it, and I could try researching this on my own, but I feel like having a resident expert here might do me better. This one comes from a good friend of the show, The Question, who is on a previous episode 2 weeks ago, and they asked, what if Deadlands got their streaming show made by Microsoft back in 2014? And this just the asking the question just threw me for a loop. First off, how much streaming was there back in the grand old days of 2014?
Like 9 years ago.
Yeah.
Like, it existed.
Netflix was streaming by 2014. It's very different stuff for the most part. Like, you got to remember, the CW was up and running at that stage. So there were things like Outlander and The Flash, and the second season of True Detective was being streamed at that point. So it was often like after the TV run, it goes on to streaming rather than premiering on streaming. This is still TV would come first, but there were kind of streaming exclusive stuff or streaming starting stuff.
Yeah, this was the era of web series, not what we would call streaming as it is now.
But you would often get like some simulcast stuff where it was on streaming and it was on the thing at the same time.
Yeah, there was some streaming, but it was a different environment back then. Apparently different enough that I totally believe that Microsoft had started setting up some kind of streaming service back in 2014 that lasted for a year and then was quietly shelved. Is that what?
Were they trying to do a Halo show around that time?
I have to say, this is all news to me.
Yeah, I think the first time we heard of a Halo show would have been quite possibly, 2014 might have been it. And then it just stayed in development hell until it came out on Netflix, 2 years ago?
There was like Forward Unto Dawn, wasn't there?
The 3D movie?
I think there was a Halo series. There was a 2022 Halo series, but before that, there was kind of some limited release stuff.
Yeah, some kind of one episode or like.
They made some Halo stuff.
Sounds familiar. I can't place it right now.
Halo Forward Unto Dawn was 2012. It was 5 15-minute episodes.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
It was live action.
I would have assumed it would be 3D CG.
No, it was live action, and it.
Sure, Vampire the Masquerade got a TV show. It was a while ago, but they did get one.
And this was back when Microsoft Studios were, doing it. So there was kind of ideas for development of things at that point. They didn't necessarily get a lot of stuff out, but that was the plan. And I know Deadlands was nosed around because Shane Hensley talked about it. He said, yeah, there was some interest for a while. They took a look at doing it because Deadlands is a lot easier to film than, say, something like D&D. Deadlands is a twisted version of the Wild West. There are options there for places you can go and film stuff. So it's not kind of we can't do it. Like Deadwood had been on TV. It had been a prestige TV project. Only ran 3 seasons, sure, but did very well. Created by David Milch. And my weirdest fact about Deadwood is that if you recall, Ian McShane plays Al Swearingen in it, but he was not David Milch's first choice. David Milch's first choice was Ed O'Neill, who had developed the series with him. And Ed O'Neill, you'll probably remember him as Al Bundy from Married with Children, or more recently, Jay Pritchard from Modern Family. And he was the guy who wanted to be Al Spurgeon when they got cancelled after 3 seasons. And a very critically acclaimed show. His response was, if we'd had Ed O'Neill playing Al Spurgeon, we'd still be him. Which is a hell of a thing to say, but there we go. And it's just kind of funky, but there would be that, okay, we're doing a Western series. It's got some horror elements in it. I think it would have done pretty well. I don't think it would have necessarily kicked off a Stranger Things style revitalization that D&D got. I'd love if it would have, but I don't think it necessarily had the nostalgia factor. But I think it would have done quite a bit for Deadlands as a series. I mean, if it wasn't like, we can look back, there have been other RPG adaptations before. If anyone remembers Kindred the Embraced. Does anyone remember Kindred the Embraced? It was not a terribly good show. But if you did a good Deadlands show, if you got like let's fantasy cast this one, if they decided to really spend money, and they probably weren't going to really spend money, but let's assume they really spent some money, and you decided to be very aggressive in your casting, and maybe you picked up someone like Timothy Oliphant, and you said, hey, you were in Deadwood, you were awesome. Will you play Ronan Lynch, the undead gunslinger in this one? And that was their main character. They could be a significant amount of Deadlands cachet in the RPG space around that. Like, if it had been a really good series, it kept going. It didn't get too schlocky. It was fun. It was good. It was well regarded. It was good acting in it. Did 4 or 5 seasons, maybe. Yeah, you could say something like Deadlands has a lot more cachet. It probably might have got a movie or two. It might be a much bigger franchise as a result, because it's kind of relatable. It's not too hard to film. You can go to locations and film it.
Yeah, wasn't Walking Dead out by that point? Like, zombie makeup would not have been too hard.
Yeah, and you would have that, Walking Dead's on 11 seasons, right? So it's possible Walking Dead was contemporaneous. Walking Dead was 2010. So yeah, Walking Dead would have been going. They would have had the tech. They would have had the experience. They go, yeah, we can do zombies. We can do undead. We can do a thing. If it hooked into people, if it was good enough at the start and it wasn't just, kind of crap, yeah, you could have a significant extra bit of meat on the Deadlands bone. And I would say that some things mightn't have changed later in Deadlands if they got kind of established. Like I don't know if they would have done the Morgana changes that happened later, where they basically said, no, there's no North and South. That war ended basically years back, and the North won. You might still have the split. I don't know, because they made the change because they're like, yeah, this is not terribly out of in step with the kind of modern opinions about it. So let's change that back to how it actually closer to how it really finished up. And basically the Morgan Le Fay changes were because of that, and they changed the setting. But if you'd had established it on TV, that mightn't happen, which might be a tension point for some fans, And interesting, I think it would be. I don't know. Like, then you could have maybe Deadlands goes D&D ish. Maybe there's a massive explosion in popularity. Like, it's possible.
I don't know if it would have gone super. It would certainly been a big.
I don't think so either. But if it did, what does the modern day RPG scene look like if Deadlands was the top RPG?
A Cowboy Revival in 2014 would hardly have been a bad thing. But like 2014 is also the year that Fifth Ed came out. Pretty sure. So if you're getting these two things as sort of your things getting a bump at the time, because like Fifth Ed had to get like a year or two on its own, trying out its own way before the Critical Role push really started. So you have a possibility where, buoyed by the bump from the streaming, that Deadlands might have done a fair bit of catch up. I don't know if we've gotten up to Pathfinder levels, but it would certainly, the exposure would certainly have helped it.
But let's do it hypothetical. Let's push it a bit further. What if Critical Role are early on, Microsoft go to them with a sponsorship deal, they run a Deadlands Critical Role thing. Microsoft just happens to go, oh, hey, we know this guy, let's get him. Maybe one of the actors on Critical Role was in the Deadlands show. Not impossible.
Not impossible.
I think they were mostly voice actors, but I have no idea if they've acted live.
Dave Manganiello isn't so he might have. Let's say he was in Deadlands. He was playing a character in it, and they were like, okay, let's go do a Deadlands, and they do a Deadlands one just as their popularity is peaking. Savage Worlds is a pretty approachable system for streaming play. You will have battle maps, but that's not a huge obstacle. You're doing that, and all of a sudden, let's say we're looking at 2023, where the biggest RPG is Deadlands, and number 2 is D&D, or maybe number 3 is D&D. Is there a continuity Deadlands forums like Pathfinder? Do you get a fork and someone they do a new edition Deadlands, and someone goes, oh no, we're going to do something different?
If you're doing this, you're absolutely going to get a classic and Savage Worlds fork.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Like, there's going to be the people who are insistent, like the Deadlands fundamentalists who want to go back to classic and refuse to even countenance Savage Worlds as an alternative.
Absolutely. I would probably find that universe a lot of fun. I would find that a lot more fun than D&D being up, fun like that. But yeah, you were going to say though, Shane.
Well, first off, like the idea of Deadlands pipping Critical Role to the post and making their own version sounds really cool. Don't get me wrong, but that would rely on like Microsoft marketing having this thought. And I don't know, that's possibly the least realistic thing about this is the Microsoft marketing team having a genius idea.
I mean, it could happen.
Even a blind squirrel finds the odd nut. Well, the reason I was thinking it might be is they might have employed Shane Hensley as the original creator in some capacity, and he might have said, ooh, this look could be good. And just as it happened, might have been chatting with the cast member and say, oh, we play an RPG. And he went, oh, why didn't you play Deadlands? Because it's an RPG. And something like that, a discussion like that could have happened, and it would have triggered off that way.
It's possible. I have to admit, like Microsoft, for all of its hugeness, is one of those companies that goes back and forth like a seesaw on whether they're completely out of touch or trying desperately to get any sort of grip on the market at all. So it's possible if they're on one of their upswings that someone in there might have the push to put out an actual smart idea.
But if they had done it and it had been a big success from TV, let's hype it was a good show. It was well regarded. It did kind of Walking Dead-ish numbers. We could easily have seen a bunch of AAA Deadlands games come out on a Microsoft platform, big Xbox exclusive games. At the time, it's not impossible they tried an MMO. And if that MMO had worked, that's a big driver of recruitment.
Well, the success of things like Red Dead Redemption 2, it suggests that there's some interest.
Redlands, Deadlands, Redemption. But if they have Microsoft support behind them, that's very possible. Although I suspect 2014 Microsoft, you'd have started off with some kind of Xbox Live spin-off, possibly some kind of arcade shooter first, and then maybe if the franchise really got support, it would have gotten into the level of actually having a what we call a AAA shooter. Although when I think about this in my mind, it comes out less like a first person. I feel like an ideal version of this would be something more like, you ever hear Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth? Like this weird investigative first person shooter, which was barely a shooter, it was actually mostly a investigate clues around Innsmouth and run away when they try to kill you simulator.
I found it too buggy to actually play. But it looked really interesting.
What if instead of Destiny 2, Microsoft said to Bungie, why not do a Deadlands looter shooter? And instead of Destiny 2, you have Deadlands.
I mean, there's plenty of crazy loot in Deadlands.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have all the crazes there. Like, it's possible. I don't think it's very likely, but it would be really fun.
I mean, even if it was just a side game from Bungie, if you actually managed to get Bungie to make a real cowboy shooter, it would be interesting to see what they would do with it.
Absolutely. Okay. And do we have a third what if to ponder?
Yeah, Dave, I believe the mantle passes to you. Which of these questions do you want?
I have to say, what if the first or most successful early game had been something else? Like even a different genre. And I've got a couple of examples in mind for possibilities.
For the records, the people at home, this question was given to us by Uber Alex, I believe.
So for ultra original fantasy RPGs, there's a web page, mazesandminotaurs.free.fr, which starts with this wonderful line. As most of you probably remember, the year 1972 saw the release of Mazes and Minotaurs, the first ever published fantasy role-playing game, opening a new era of heroic adventure and mythic odysseys. Like, the whole conceit is that, that this in fact was the first, fantasy RPG, and if it was based on Greek mythology, ancient Greek mythology tropes, as opposed to more Western European tropes.
Unfortunately, I haven't played Mazes and Minotaurs myself and seen how it changes the D&D formula. But the idea of how different would things be if we had this different paradigm? And like, it's not particularly hard to imagine the Omni Geeks of the Wisconsin area coming up with a different inspiration for their game. Like, the original inspirations, I believe, was like a Cold War style board game, Brownstein, I believe it was referred to. So, could it have been that maybe instead of being inspired to make a fantasy Brownstein and that turned into D&D, Dave Arneson was inspired to make some kind of sci-fi Brownstein? It's hard to tell. Certainly Pulp Sci-Fi was strong in those days. After all, that same year, Star Wars was going to come out.
A pulp sci-fi RPG kicking off, definitely possible. Another one I was kind of had my eye on, which it doesn't use quite the same conceit as Maze and Minotaurs, but Warriors of the Red Planet is it's a swords and planet role playing game. It's effectively Barsoom without using the name Barsoom.
We got a similar question from our good friend Conrad Kinch asking, what if instead of fantasy, it was a sword and planet adventure? So yeah, certainly in the modern day, when we have these OSR retro clones, the idea of transferring the mechanics and emphasis into this style is strong. But if you start with it at the beginning,
Definitely going to have an effect.
I mean, I think the big one that would have an influence on it would be Star Wars, considering the time. I think even if it didn't have that influence initially, when they saw Star Wars, they'd steal a bunch of ideas from Star Wars.
yeah, I think we kind of end up with like the Lord of the Rings effect, because how much of this is true and how much this is Gary Gygax trying to give himself extra credit, but the way Gary tells it, his vision of D&D at the start was far more Conan-like and didn't have elves and dwarves, but because this was about the time when the first proper printing of Lord of the Rings novels was happening around the US, and people were really getting into the Lord of the Rings mindset, that people were starting to come to him, oh, I want to play elf, I want to play hobbit, etc., etc. And the story he tells it is that he had to fold in order to get his game to run at all. It's hard to say whether he is disingenuous, he is a shyster at the best of times. Yeah, I would say very likely the effect would be that Dave and Gary would write a version of the game which is very much more Sword and Planet. Sword and Planet, for those who aren't aware, is stuff like John Carter of Mars.
John Carter of Mars.
There are other examples of it. Jack Vance, the infamous Jack Vance, was big into all kinds of Sword and Planet. These were staples of novels, basically from the 20s to the 50s, of just a rugged Earthman would either be teleported to another planet, isekai style, or would crash land on a planet for their atomic rocket ship, and they immediately start running into horrible monsters and beautiful alien women, and have to pick up a sword and go to town, usually while wearing extremely little, as was the style on the planet.
Do you want me to tell you some of the knock-ons of this? Humans are not the jack of all trades under this model of RPG.
Yeah, well, they're strong and tough, as they would be on another world. Certain other worlds.
They would definitely do the whole in the weakened gravity of this crappy planet. I can leap 1,000 stories, or that's definitely a thing. Ooh. So you would have let's call them the Green Martians. No, the Green Martians are the four-armed dudes.
The Red Martians are the Deja Thors and such were the...
yeah, okay.
They would be the jack of all trade diplomat sorts. The kind of the standard face of the party. Whereas the Earthman is the rugged adventurer,
Oh, yeah.
with stat minimums. One of the things I think would be that they would do an extensive, instead of dungeon hopping, it would be world hopping.
Scale will be different.
A little bit like Spelljammer, you go to a different procedurally generated world, which is a bunch of tables you roll on that modify everything else you do. Because there will be different levels of they would have a gravity table. And they would go, these are the modifiers that are in place now that we are on this lower gravity world or even higher gravity world. And they would do things around that. And it would be really freaky and people would complain about it. But it would be a staple of it, what the gravity of the planet will be.
The dungeon thing would sort of be pushed to one side, and it would be way more about crossing the dread wastes upon your hover barge or whatever, or capturing a whole bunch of pterodactyl things and flying them across the wastelands. Or you probably have all those Hexcrawl outdoor survival rules, but also have a whole bunch of stuff for how to wrestle alien horses and riding birds and such.
The wrestling, actually good grappling rules.
Yeah, maybe.
We didn't say they'd be good.
Okay,
We said they'd
fair.
exist.
Well,
so this would be the setup. This would be the first book. The first three. You have your three booklets of various things. Book full of character creation rules, book full of world traversal rules and gravity tables and such, and a book of knockoff alien monsters and ancient science McGibbles to steal from the vaults of the degenerate future ancient races and such. So it wouldn't be a million miles from where D&D ended up, but there'd be subtle changes here and there.
I actually think instead of being a monsters manual, they would do a planetary gazetteer.
Oh,
with a planetary creation rules as primary, and then inhabitant creation rules to follow on, and a couple of sample planets and sample aliens, and then they do a series of gazetteers, which are this specific world, this specific world, this specific world. So they have a core one, which is kind of the engine that explains it all, and then you get supplements. And maybe that ring binder would have stuck around, where instead it's in a ring binder, and you basically clip in, you buy a new gazetteer, and you put it in there. And that's for this one. And then you still have a player's book, which describes all the player stuff. And the referee guide is probably quite different because it doesn't need to have all more of the rules get put in the gazetteer. And the player's guide, the GM's guide, probably is something different because the gazetteer would have all the loot rules for that planet and what you can find on that planet and specific encounters. So what goes in the GM section there, probably some different stuff.
Here's the thing, though. Okay, so you have that setup to start. That's your starting setup. But then the game comes out, and then Star Wars hits, and we get Star Wars fever. Immediately, we have this pressure. Oh, we need to have a supplement that makes it more Star Wars.
Yes.
And this is where you get the first split. Because much like the original D&D had the Greyhawk supplement, adding in the Paladin and the Thief. And then that starts a whole kerfuffle on, oh, the Thief is broken because it introduces skills. Oh, the Paladin is broken because stat minimums. And you're going to have that same fight here, but it's going to be, oh, you had let's say originally they call it the Forceful Man or something. And then they have to rename it after a out of court settlement, and they call it, the Kineticist or something. And they end up accidentally making, say, also like there's a Han Solo class, there's a gunslinger class, whereas before there was barely any guns in the setting at all. Now all of a sudden there's an entire class built around guns, and endless GMs writing in to complain, oh, you've ruined the whole thing. Is that just going to go the same way as the past, where people just sort of have to roll over and admit, or do we start getting early edition splits straight away? As
I think they call the first one not the Force Man, they'll call it the Psyker or the Psychic. And they'll have something like a Mind Blade, which will be their take on kind of Star Wars. And that'll become the class everyone complains about. The Psychic with its Mind Blade as being the ridiculous kind of class that dominates the rest of the game.
I would never imagine there would be an enemy balance. After all, this is the replacement for the Paladin in this timeline. So yeah, it would never be uncontroversial because because he would
Solar Knight.
Yeah, Solar Knight, Psyker, Mind Bladist, whatever. But Gary Gygax would put in a whole bunch of ridiculous roleplay restrictions into it. Basically inventing his own Jedi code.
Oh, absolutely. But you know what else would happen?
What?
They'd watch the cantina scene, and they would create a random alien race generator for players, where you basically create an alien race, and all the aliens then have those stats.
Yeah.
And that will be, they give you some blank pages at the back of the gazetteer for filling in the alien race you can, because there's thousands of races across the galaxy, across thousands of worlds, and you'd roll one up, and that would be your alien race, you'd name it. And you'd basically put in, and then he might do a thing where someone can mail in their alien race, and we might print the best ones.
Uh-huh.
You know, and there will then be a bunch of kind of controversial and weird stuff in the background. Why do these guys exist? Oh, guy, you know, an 8-year-old made those guys up and rolled really well in the stats. They get used a lot as bad guys, and that will be one of the things that kind of fell out of it. I think there would be, it would, the standard kind of D&D's kind of creativity and stuff would go in slightly different directions. And I think procedurally generating worlds and aliens will become a big chunk of that first D&D, or that first equivalent to D&D. And then you're going to get the knockoffs following off that. I don't know if the Star Wars RPG happens as fast in that situation, or does it happen differently? Because it's always there. Is there the same appetite for it when someone actually does an official one?
Yeah.
The official one does drain things away, unless the official one is complete crap, which is possible.
Or the official one is licensed because they're already doing it effectively. So it becomes a license setting initially, and that maybe would have weird effects on the Star Wars expanded universe, because most of that draws itself from the West End Games stuff, where they had to explain what the war was. So instead of various different RPG writers having a huge influence on Star Wars early lore, Gary Gygax has a huge influence on Star Wars early lore, because he gets to explain and write all about this stuff. What weird stuff would make its way into Star Wars based on Gary Gygax writing up tracks explaining who Pruneface was? Because think about it, because that's what he'd be doing. He'd be going, I'm going to explain, I'm going to build an ecology, explaining, you know, his symbiosis with the natural world.
Yeah. Oh, God.
Think about it. Imagine it with your mind.
I don't want it. He did this entire series about Gary Gygax's mind in book form. I don't know if we want to revisit that. Although you at home viewers should possibly re-listen to all of our Tomo Gygax episodes. You know what I'm curious though is, does this change invalidate Traveller or legitimize it? Because Traveller does mechanically. Traveller, the first major sci-fi RPG, mechanically Traveller does an awful lot of this, what we're suggesting, this procedural planet generation and quest generation. And, you know, there's random tables for days, all different rules for different gravities, rules for different things. It has its own weird career system and doesn't really use XP as D&D or this D&D club would have it. Mechanically, it's covering a lot of the same weight, but Traveller has the advantage of being extremely, well, relatively to this we're suggesting, hard sci-fi. Free trader Beowulf, floating in space, oxygen leaking, we're breaking up, etc., etc. There's a very different vibe to Traveller, and I'm wondering, does the existence of a mechanically similar but extremely differently vibe?
I think Traveller becomes even harder sci-fi.
Oh, I absolutely see that.
Oh, and as a response, yeah.
I think even harder. It's like maybe there's no FTL. Maybe there's no FTL at all, and that's their
generation ships.
Yeah, and stuff like that. I think that, and weirdly, they might become dungeons in space.
As they're running into like precursor civilization ruins.
And everyone makes progressively more efficient engines so you can catch up with them, but still no one makes FTL.
There is a Black Hack spin-off called Golgotha with a premise which isn't a million miles from that, but yeah, basically it's dungeons in space, like, is the conceit.
I mean, that would be the evolutionary thing, right? It's been abandoned by this sci-fi version of D&D, and instead someone's got to do dungeons for the first time, and it makes sense that it's a harder sci-fi game. Now, the interesting one is, what's the first big fantasy game? I'm wondering, is it Wolfrup? Is it a Warhammer that emerges out of much more of a wargaming route? That's there's still people doing wargaming, and rather than D&D inspired, it's much more. Maybe it's like, oh, let's do a spin of Tolkien, and except it's set in, like, you know, the Age of Gunpowder, and you get something that looks a lot like Warhammer, but there's a couple of changes. And Warhammer is the first fantasy one. So fantasy RPGs are seen as a real British thing.
Like, so instead of a British or OSR branch, it becomes the even larger branch, like the main branch.
Yeah. Now, it'd be weird because, like, early Wolfrup is heavily influenced by D&D and Call of Cthulhu. But it would be interesting if the first real kind of fantasy one came out of a let's do a guns version of Tolkien. Everything's a bit grim and gritty. You know, they decided that was their hook. Or maybe Warhammer instead is the super high fantasy one, which decides to be all of Warhammer is all about King Arthur as an inspiration. And as a result, without having to go, let's do a grim and gritty version of fantasy, Warhammer is instead the super high fantasy. So instead, it looks much more like Ages of Sigmar.
Times of flat circles, what we're learning in this episode.
Yeah, but we're just speculating, you know? What would it be like? And I think maybe high fantasy Warhammer would be the thing you might get, because you're going to try and be different. You're going to say, how are we going to make ourselves different to this, you know? And you can either be grimmer and grittier, one option, or you could be even higher kind of fantasy, you know?
Yeah.
Maybe you want to be similar in one way and different in another.
Interesting. So, Bretonians and Bob Goblins. I don't know.
Absolutely.
Interesting. I mean, that's what ifs are all about. So, folks, if you would like us to explore the infinite possibilities of a world where perhaps I was not a bloodthirsty warlord, but a gentle wizard,
Man of peace.
man of peace and magic. A horrible thought, but such a dark timeline as possible. But if you would like to explore these possibilities of a podcast from another time, you can hit us up on our social media or come into our Discord, where we openly accept questions of this type from all comers. Don't know why, we're just nice like that, I guess. But until such time as we return to the what if, this party is over. Thanks for listening to The Adventuring Party. You can find show notes and links to things we've mentioned at www.theadventuringparty.net and on our Facebook page. You can leave comments there, or talk to our Twitter account at AdventuringPTY, or you can record a voice message at www.speakpipe.com/theadventuringparty. We can also be contacted directly by email at party@theadventuringparty.net. If you'd like to be in touch with the party all the time, come join our Discord server, link in the show notes. The Adventuring Party is released under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share Alike on Version 3 license.